Sure.
Here's section 1 of the script with a minimum of 500 words, direct and to the point, without scene descriptions, repetition, or filler. Sarah never looked for attention. She wasn't the type to chase after compliments or dress to impress. But people noticed her. There was something about the way she listened when others spoke, the calm in her eyes, and how she'd pause before replying, like every word deserved thought. Psychology says women who engage in active listening are perceived as more attractive, not because of how they look, but because of how they make others feel. Sarah had that effect, but she barely noticed. Daniel, her partner of 4 years, admired her stillness. In the beginning, it grounded him. Where he was impulsive, she was reflective. Their chemistry was quiet but certain. For a while, that was enough. He worked long hours, ambitious and driven, and assumed she understood. She did, to a point. But understanding doesn't cancel out loneliness. And loneliness isn't always loud. It often arrives in silence, in moments where nothing is wrong, yet nothing feels right either. What Sarah couldn't explain was the constant ache of disconnection. Her body responded before her mind did, slower heartbeat when he touched her, shorter breaths during conversations, and a creeping sense that her presence didn't matter. Women's bodies are biologically wired to respond to emotional cues. When those cues vanish, oxytocin levels drop, even in long-term relationships. She didn't feel unsafe with Daniel. She just didn't feel seen. There's a psychological phenomenon known as emotional deprivation disorder. It doesn't scream for attention. It builds quietly, especially in women who internalize instead of confront. Sarah had learned not to complain. Complaints sounded like weakness. She'd grown up watching her mother endure emotional neglect and still set the dinner table each night. So she did the same, minus the tears. Daniel loved her, but he loved through actions. He paid the bills on time, remembered birthdays, and offered practical support. What he missed were the subtle cues. The half-second longer she looked at him before speaking, the change in tone when she said, "I'm fine," and the lack of warmth in her goodnight kiss. Research shows women are biologically more attuned to microbehaviors in relationships. Their bodies can detect instability before their conscious mind processes it. Sarah's nervous system was already telling her something was off. At work, she found herself daydreaming more than usual. Not about anyone in particular, but about being understood, being asked how she felt, and not just what she thought. She didn't want a new relationship. She wanted emotional resonance. This longing wasn't about lust. It was about depth. Another psychology fact: women's brains release more dopamine during emotionally stimulating conversations than during physical intimacy. For Sarah, it was the absence of those conversations that had become unbearable. She didn't know what she was searching for. She only knew that the slow erosion of connection felt more dangerous than any argument ever could. A woman can love someone deeply and still feel starved inside. That's what no one tells you. That's what Sarah was only just beginning to understand. Let me know when you're ready for section 2. Of course. Here's section 2 of the script, with a minimum of 500 words, continuing directly and tightly from the emotional groundwork of section 1. It started with a message, nothing flirtatious, just friendly. Aiden worked in another department, someone she'd crossed paths with occasionally. He was thoughtful in a way that caught her off guard. He remembered small details, like her favorite tea or the book she mentioned weeks ago. Studies show that when women feel emotionally seen, their brains release oxytocin, creating a sense of safety and connection. That's what Aiden gave her without trying. They began talking more often, always brief, always casual. But every interaction left a residue. She found herself replaying his words, not because they were romantic, but because they made her feel acknowledged. Emotional validation can be as addictive as physical attraction, and sometimes more dangerous. Sarah wasn't looking to cheat. She simply craved something she didn't know she'd been missing: attention without agenda. Aiden had a way of asking questions that made her feel like her thoughts mattered. Not just surface-level conversation, but things that probed deeper. How she felt about her career. What music made her feel alive. These exchanges were nothing Daniel ever asked. And it wasn't his fault exactly. He was wired differently. But neuroscience confirms that women's emotional processing centers are more active than men's. They seek depth, and when it's lacking, the brain interprets it as neglect. Sarah began looking forward to their conversations. Her body reacted, slightly faster heart rate, a warmth in her chest, a physical sense of alertness. These weren't signs of guilt yet, but they were signs of awakening. Mirror neurons in the female brain respond strongly to empathetic behavior. When Aiden looked at her, it wasn't just eye contact, it was presence. That was the difference. Daniel saw her, but Aiden noticed her. There was a moment that changed things. A casual comment from Aiden said half-jokingly, "If I had someone like you, I'd never let her feel invisible." She laughed it off, but something in her chest tightened. That's when the line began to blur, not in action, but in intent. Emotional infidelity starts long before physical boundaries are crossed. It begins with secrecy, selective sharing, and thoughts that feel safer in someone else's presence. Sarah found herself editing her conversations with Daniel. She stopped mentioning Aiden. That omission wasn't random, it was calculated. Psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that comes from holding conflicting beliefs or behaviors. She still loved Daniel, but she was slowly building a world where Aiden existed in the space Daniel used to occupy. She didn't fantasize about Aiden in a romantic sense. She fantasized about being understood. That distinction mattered. At least, it did to her. But intent doesn't always shield from consequences. Studies show that women are more likely to justify emotional affairs because they often tie intimacy to emotional fulfillment, not just physical proximity. Sarah knew this was becoming something more. Not because of what had happened, but because of what she wanted to happen. That realization, more than anything, left her breathless. Not with excitement, but with fear. Let me know when you're ready for Section 3. Absolutely. Here's Section 3, continuing seamlessly, maintaining the quality, direct tone, and minimum 500-word count. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. But the moment came quietly, like most dangerous things do, not in grand gestures, but in small decisions she couldn't take back. It was after another conversation with Aiden that felt too intimate, too easy. He reached for her hand, just for a second, and she didn't pull away. Her body betrayed her first. The warmth that spread wasn't guilt. It was relief. When it finally happened, when the boundary broke, it wasn't planned. There was no candlelit moment, no confession of feelings. Just proximity, attention, and timing. Psychology confirms that emotional intimacy accelerates physical attraction. In women, arousal isn't just about the body. It begins in the mind. Her body reacted instinctively, as if answering a question she hadn't asked out loud. Right after, the shame hit her, not because she was caught, but because she realized she couldn't undo what was done. The female brain processes emotional betrayal more deeply than physical. She hadn't just crossed a line, she'd shattered a version of herself she once trusted. The guilt didn't feel like punishment. It felt like grief. Daniel noticed changes, though he couldn't name them. She was quieter, more distracted. She avoided eye contact, answered in fragments. Men are less likely to detect microbehaviors in relationships, but they still feel the absence of connection. And the human brain, male or female, is hardwired to detect lies, even if subconsciously. He didn't accuse her. He just asked, "Is everything okay?" She lied with a nod. Sarah couldn't eat the next day. Cortisol, the stress hormone, spiked. Her body carried the weight of her decisions, even when her mouth stayed shut. The psychology of secrecy is brutal. Keeping a secret activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the same region involved in pain. Every time she looked at Daniel, she felt it, a physical ache that no apology could ease. She thought about ending things with Aiden, but it wasn't that simple. He had seen a side of her she didn't know existed. Ending it would mean facing the emptiness again. But staying meant living a double life. Women are often more emotionally invested in infidelity than men. That's what makes walking away harder. It's not the person, they miss the version of themselves they became with that person. Sarah began to avoid both of them. She was exhausted. Her body was in constant fight or flight mode, a physiological response triggered by chronic emotional conflict. Her sleep suffered, her appetite vanished, her thoughts looped without rest. This wasn't passion. This was chaos. She still loved Daniel. That was the worst part. Love didn't disappear. It just became tangled in lies. And with every day that passed, the lie grew heavier. She wasn't afraid of losing him. She was afraid of what staying would require her to become. She thought infidelity was about sex or attraction. It wasn't. It was about being needed, being chosen, being alive. And now she felt none of those things. Only silence. Only consequence. Ready for Section 4 when you are. Of course. Here's Section 4, maintaining the same standard, direct, concise, and with a minimum of 500 words. Sarah stood at a crossroad no one could see. The lie hadn't come to light, but it lived inside her. Loud, constant, and unrelenting. She knew the facts. Studies show that 68% of women who cheat never confess. Not out of malice, but because they weigh the destruction against the guilt and decide silence is the lesser crime. But silence has its own price. She couldn't look at Daniel the same. Every kind gesture from him felt undeserved, every smile a quiet reminder of what he didn't know. Her guilt wasn't just emotional, it was physiological. Research shows the body stores emotional trauma. Her shoulders ached. Her chest felt heavy. She was living in a body that remembered what her mind wanted to forget. She thought about coming clean. There's a theory in psychology. Truth restores neural coherence. When people reveal secrets, the prefrontal cortex calms, and the body begins to regulate again. But healing comes with destruction. Telling the truth meant burning the life she'd built. And yet, lying meant erasing the person she wanted to become. She stopped answering Aiden's messages. Not out of strength, but necessity. The longer she stayed in between, the more it cost her. Aiden wasn't the villain. He had offered connection in a space where she was starving. But what she took wasn't his to give. And what he stirred in her couldn't coexist with the life she was pretending to live. Daniel didn't change. He remained steady, present, and loyal. But something shifted. He sensed her distance. He didn't press, but his eyes stayed on her longer than usual, as if searching for something behind her words. Men aren't always verbal processors, but they feel absence like a weight. The absence of trust. The absence of truth. Sarah had 3 choices: confess, leave, or stay silent forever. None of them promised peace. Psychology doesn't offer moral judgment, only insight. Some women confess and lose everything but find relief. Others stay and live a quiet lie, building walls around their guilt. A few walk away, not to run, but to reset. She chose the last. Not because it was easier, but because she couldn't live with halves anymore. Half love, half truth, half presence. She left without explaining everything. Just enough to preserve dignity, not enough to clear her conscience. That part was hers alone to carry. Months passed. Healing didn't come quickly. But her body began to unclench. Her sleep returned. She no longer jumped at every memory. Science calls it emotional recalibration, the process of the nervous system relearning safety after prolonged internal conflict. She missed Daniel, and she missed the version of herself that once felt whole with him. But she didn't regret leaving. Not because it was right, but because it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't hiding from herself. Sometimes, the biggest betrayal isn't against someone else. It's the quiet neglect of our own truth. Sarah learned that too late. But not too late to begin again. Let me know if you'd like a voiceover version, captions, or visual direction tailored for a faceless video.